I've read about this, but I never thought I'd see it.
So, was he alive or dead?
I've seen birds stuffed and mounted so lifelike, you'd swear you saw them breathing. Yeah, maybe we've got a case of that here. Get me my kit.
The two of you are majorly demented, you know that?
He should have gone home when he found the scar we planted. Came here to save her. Caring for the living, not part of his job description.
Oh. 53?
In all the excitement, I guess I lost count. Think I'm mounting with his head up his ass.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, welcoming a new guest today and a fellow podcaster, and that is Tyler Patrick. Tyler, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, man. I'm really pumped to be here. Been listening to your show, and of course, we have mutual friend of Mr. Anthony Desiato. So it was cool. Like I saw your posting about looking for guests, and because I'm still new to like Blue Sky and everything, I don't check it as often. So there was this little delay of when I saw, hey, I need new guests, and I put up, oh, I'll do it. So it's exciting to be here and chat.
Yeah, I got that response. I'm like, oh wow, that's kind of a coming late to the party, but I'm totally happy to have you on. And yes, as you said, like I know you from general interactions among similar podcast folks. So I'm glad to have you on and to actually meet you for the first time. But before we jump too much into today's movie, why don't you talk a little bit about yourself?
So I host the Krypton Report Podcast. That's my main podcast. I've been doing it for, I want to say, Solomon, how old are you? 9. 9 years. Because I started it right about the same year my son was born. And it started off as just being kind of a Supergirl TV show, watch along type podcast, but I wanted to do more with it. Made it just a Superman podcast, but then it's also just mainly Superman focused, but DC in general. We cover all DC stuff as well, but mainly sticking to the Kryptonian side. And then I do something I started on my Jonathan Tyler Patrick YouTube channel, a little thing I call the Requel Podcast, where basically I take a property, say what we're talking about today, or a franchise or whatever, and then I kind of pitch it to you like if I was in charge of remaking, rebooting, sequel, prequel, midquel. So I kind of do it's like a movie pitch on what I would do with existing properties. You know, with today's culture of everything being rebooted and sequelized, it's kind of just something fun to talk about, and think through if you were given the opportunity to make a movie of this franchise, what you would do with it. And, I started doing that, and I'm working on having people come on and we pitch each other, the ideas and stuff. So that's what I do kind of in the podcasting world. So
That's really cool. That whole Requel podcast idea, that is a really unique idea. And I don't know if anyone's ever done anything like that, but it makes so much sense because I know I've certainly had these moments where on the show too, where I've pitched like alternate versions of the movie we're talking about. So I'm definitely gonna have to check that out. That sounds really interesting.
yeah, I'll definitely just have to get you on sometime. We'll find a topic. Like I was telling you off mic is, I have my degree in screenwriting and I always am working on scripts, but I don't always want to talk about what I'm working on because I don't want to give away my stories. But it's a fun exercise to just kind of work the mind to take another IP that I have no connection to, that's not going to really affect me, and kind of talk about what I would do with it. It gets the brain moving.
No, I think that's a really good idea. It's a very interesting idea for a show. So since we do talk about superheroes here, what is kind of like your history with superheroes? What got you interested in them in the first place?
It's funny because I don't really remember in the sense of they were always kind of there. Like there's tons of pictures as me as a young child in my Superman and Batman pajamas. I have memories of course, the old cape towel, or towel cape. Yeah. And there's a picture my mom has of me crying in front of the washing machine because my Superman PJs are being washed. And I remember having like a box of comics for a birthday. And of course, I had the VHS of the Max Fleischer Supermans. So like there's this history of like that's why I'm always more prone to DC. I love it all, but DC is more of my home because I have more of that foundation. And then, of course, 89 Batman's like, it was there. I was 4. I was born in 85. Not ashamed to talk about it, I don't care. And then, Batman the animated series and that time of like the X-Men cartoons right there is where I really have strong memories of the history with, comics and superheroes and just being part of, that culture. And my dad was in the military, so we always lived near, excuse me, bases. And there was a little shop that had a spinner rack. There was no comic book stores near me, but his uniform shop had an old spinner rack, and I used to grab books off there. So that's kind of the origin start.
Very cool. Yeah, I similar experience to that too. I mean, I was pretty much the same generation. I was born in 83, actually. In fact, you were born the same year as my sister, actually. But I had the same kind of situation where I'd had the Superman and Batman were always kind of around when I was a kid. I don't really have a memory of when I first experienced them. I do know that I watched the Superman the movie VHS so much the damn tape broke. So I do remember that happening when I was a kid. And it's funny when you talk about the situation, the picture with you crying because your mom had to wash your Superman pajamas. We bought a Spider-Man pajama suit for my son, and he's 2 now, and he loves Spider-Man, and it actually, when we bought it last year, he's already grown out of it. So we actually had to take and it's a winter clothing. It's like really warm, and it gets very hot here in Japan in the summers. And he kept wanting to wear it like a few months ago when it was at the peak of the summer season. Just like he kept insisted on putting it on. He would not take it off even. So yeah, definitely had those kinds of experiences as well.
My son is 9, and he's growing to that point where he's starting to get out of like the kid size PJs, where he's in that awkward, like I might have to start buying like small adult for some things, or and I was trying to tell him like both my kids had a big growth spurt over this year. And it's just funny because there's stuff they're wearing, like, I love this. I'm like, but you're growing out of it, but I don't want to give it up. And I'm like, I'm like, it happens. You were talking about Superman. What's funny is for the longest time, I didn't know what Superman the movie was and Superman 2 because I had them taped from TV together on a VHS, and I wore it out, and then that was it. And in my mind, I had it all jumbled. So it wasn't until years later when they released it on DVD that I was able to go and buy it, that I remember buying it and sitting down and watching it and be like, wait, what is, huh? And I was like, oh, okay. So it's just funny because there were so many things like Return of the Jedi I had taped off TV. I can still watch it today and tell you where the commercial breaks were in because that was the only Star Wars I had for till what 97 when they released the THX box set.
Yeah.
So it's just funny the things like we grew up like that our children will never experience.
No, I remember that. I remember we used to have like a whole bunch of cassette tapes from just recordings of Saturday morning cartoons where we just run the VCR all morning to catch everything. And just like all the different commercials were filled in with that. Yeah, and that's something else kids probably won't really experience anymore is the whole idea of like the Saturday morning cartoon.
Yeah. I blame Cartoon Network. I have a whole working theory because once Cartoon Network became a thing, and they started putting 24-hour cartoons on, and then others like Disney XD and all that stopped. Regular cable networks stopped making cartoons, which stopped making toys. Because there was toys for every show that was on.
Oh, yeah.
And you had cartoons at like 6 a.m, then after school. And then once that started, the toy store stopped carrying so much because there wasn't that many toys. And then now we don't have Toys R Us anymore. So I blame Cartoon Network for the destruction of Saturday morning and Toys R Us.
That's an interesting theory, and I think there's something to that. I mean, I remember we were in we were in the States last year and we were in Target, and I remember walking with my kids in the toy aisle, and I was looking at the shelves, and like physically the shelves for like the action hero line were like half the size that they used to be. Like they weren't as long. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is, and I'm looking around at the options there, and yeah, there's just not as much as there were back when I was a kid. Plus they're also like 3 times as more expensive too.
Oh
So
yeah.
there was that
But
aspect.
it's crazy. You and I being of the same generation, being able to look at this. Like, I walked on the toy aisle. Like me and my son were at Walmart earlier today, and we walked down, and there's like Transformers, Ninja Turtles, He-Man, then like Batman superheroes, Marvel superheroes, wrestlers, Star Wars. And it's like there's really not a whole lot of what is new and like current to like this generation. It's like the same stuff that we grew up being recycled again and again that's in the toy aisles. And like you said, it's a small compared to what I grew up with. Um, and it's just kind of sad because there used to be toys that you would find like, what is this? And you'd be excited because you had no idea what this was. And now it's like, and now they don't even keep toys in stock. Like I see people post stuff like, look what I found at Target. And I'm like, I've yet to find that at my local Target or Walmart or anything here. So it's just kind of a bummer.
In fact, that whole finding something random and just being enticed by it, that was actually how I bought my first X-Men figure, because they had this line of X-Men figures and they had a Wolverine figure. And I knew nothing about the character. This is before the animated series came out. All I knew was like, oh, who's this guy? He's got this mask that comes off and it's like a ring. He's got these claws. He's wearing this brown and gold suit. I'm like, this guy looks awesome. And I begged my grandfather to buy it for me. And then like I think it was like maybe a year or 2 years later is when X-Men came out on Fox, and that really kind of like, and then that led into me getting into comics as a whole from there. But yeah, those types of things, doesn't seem like we have a lot of that happening anymore, unfortunately.
We don't. And you have young children, I have young children, and I'm always a advocate for the fact that there needs to be toys and there needs to be content of the characters that we love to pass on to our children. That's why like I was very happy with My Adventures with Superman. Great show. The kids loved it. I mean, my kids got more into it, maybe more than I did, but there's no merchandise like for me to back up to show my support for this show to help cultivate the kids that way. And I mean, and I say DC a lot because it seems like for a while DC got more into catering to their older fans and more mature fans, that I'm like, if you don't do something for the kids, we're not going to be able to continue these characters. There's nothing for them,
No, I think you're right, because
Batman. Of course, they
yes,
always
no,
make Batman toys.
yeah, but even when we were kids, I remember when like the DC shows were on the air, like Batman the Animated Series and Superman, like they did have those toy lines, but they weren't as broad or as robust as like the Marvel stuff, because Marvel had owned Toy Biz back then, so they were able to get them to do basically whatever they wanted to. And that actually drove a lot of my Marvel fandom, was because there were all these random weird characters that I'd see figures of, and I'd be like, oh, this guy looks cool, let me buy the figure. And then I'd read about the bio on the background, I'd look up the Marvel trading cards, and that is what made me a Marvel fan, was like all of that synergistic stuff, which yeah, it's sad we don't have a lot of that anymore. I mean, my kids are right now, they love the Spectacular Spider-Man, and there's not really a lot in. Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, people were talking about Spider-Man 94 with all the X-Men 97 nostalgia, but I'm like, no, Spectacular Spider-Man was so far superior to that.
It was so good because, it's so hilarious to me. We talk about Spider-Man. I grew up where Spider-Man was in college. He was an adult, because of Spider-Man 94 and then the comics, that's where he was. And then when they made the movie, he starts in high school, then immediately he's grown up. And I'm like, that's cool. That's how I grew up with Spider-Man, So then for my son who gets Spider-Man set in high school, it's so weird because I'm like, that's not like the Spider-Man that I know and I grew up with. But that's how he's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
Spectacular was such a good show.
It was, yeah.
And it's the one that like most people forget about.
That's the disappointing thing. Like there's this like mini revolution of Marvel cartoons in like in the early mid aughts, and it's just, or late aughts, I guess you'd say. And it's just like they all got like these only 1 or 2 seasons, and then they were gone.
Yeah. And then you had like that last push right before Disney bought with like Wolverine and the X-Men.
Also a great show.
The first season, I remember was it Earth's Mightiest Heroes event, the Avengers?
Yep.
The first season was really good. The second season wasn't. And then Ultimate Spider-Man, where all these right before Disney bought everything, or right after, somewhere it was right there in the mix before they started like rebooting everything constantly. Good cartoons.
Yeah. So one of the things we like to talk about too on this show before we jump into the movie discussion is what are you interested in lately? Comics, movies, TV, books, games, whatever it might be. Anything grabbing your interest these days?
So me and my son Solomon have been playing a lot of Sonic games together, like all kinds of different ones, because he is so pumped for the new Sonic movie. So we've been doing that. I'm always reading Superman because we're doing a whole thing for the podcast. So I'm always staying up with my DC books because I bought the app. Like I no longer go to the comic book store because the one closest to us closed and the nearest one's an hour away. So I go there for special events and occasions. I've been rewatching Dexter with my wife. Like that's been kind of something like it's weird because like I'm not afraid to talk about. We had a family tragedy. My sister-in-law passed away. It's been about a month, so I'm good. And I felt I felt more comfort in like the more violent shows and more like I said, like, so I just started watching Dexter again with my wife, and I found comfort in that compared to trying to watch stuff to make me happy and everything. But I've kind of been there, and just whatever pops up, because just trying to stay on top of things. Still haven't got to watch Godzilla -1 because my son's a huge Godzilla fan. He got to go see it in theaters. I didn't. And every time I go to watch it, my wife's like, "Oh, I'm busy," because my wife's in college online, and it's just like we haven't had a chance to actually sit down, all three of us, and watch it and like focus on it. And I'm just bummed about that too. But
I think they have I think it's out on Blu-ray now too, I believe.
Not in the States yet.
It's not in the States yet. Okay. It is here.
No.
It is here in Japan, because that's how I watched it. I'm kind of curious what your son thought about it
he loved it.
Because you said really? Okay. Because it's not like, it's not like the legendary ones where it's much more about spectacle. It's much more, this human drama type thing, much more like the original Godzilla, or like Shin Godzilla's.
So just to kind of give you an idea, like me and him sat, I don't know, a couple months ago, we watched the original, sat there, we did a podcast of me and him talking about and going through the original. I got the box set of the original Toho, and we've gone through those one at a time together. It's one of those things that he found Godzilla himself, kind of thing, like, and he fell in love with it. It's nothing that I pushed on him, and he loves it all. So what happened was I bought tickets for us to go as a family to go see -1. It was me, my wife, him, but my daughter got real sick, and so we gave my tickets to my in-laws, and they took Solomon, and then me and my wife took my daughter to urgent care, and they went and saw it in theaters. And he came back, he said, "Daddy, is so good, but it's so deep." So he's a deep kid, but he's been talking about it. And I asked him, because today was kind of like boys' day. My wife's been out with the daughter, and he was like, "No, Dad, we have to watch it with Mom." So that's where I'm at.
It's we're actually I've got my other podcast, Japan on Film, where I talk about Japanese movies, and the not the season we're doing at the time we're recording this, but season 12, which is gonna be coming out probably at the end of this year. -1 is on there, so he might be interested in listening to that when we talk about that, because
we both will.
It's a very deep movie. There's a lot of stuff involving like history and like the war and all that kind of stuff, and it was so well done. I was very, very impressed by it. For my part, what I was interested in is, it's funny you mentioned the Superman comic books. Just yesterday, I finished reading one of the latest trades for the Superman books. It's called The Chained. So it's the
Oh, okay.
one
Yeah,
with
yeah.
so, and that was a good story. I'm digging what Joshua Williamson has been reading with that. Although from what I've heard from, Justin over on Anthony's show, I'm not quite sure about how I feel about House of Brainiac.
You know what? I'm not no spoilers or anything to it, but like I felt like House of Brainiac was two ideas that they fused into one. Instead of taking their time to do the Zarnian story that then goes into House of Brainiac and like spreading it out, I felt they just mushed it together. And I don't know if you feel this way, but I've had this conversation with a lot of people. It seems like a lot of modern comics, they come up with these story arc ideas, but they can't stick the landing. It's like when you get to the final issue, it just feels like, yeah, like it either it's over too soon or it's just like action art pages or it's abstract that you're like, what just happened? It's like they build up a really great story, but they can't end it. And I've seen that a lot with comics recently.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just like all the change in the marketplace, and I think just some story ideas are maybe, you know, being ended prematurely, or they're being forced to, like, switch things up. I mean, I know from one example is the Joe Casey was doing a Zod miniseries, and I think Anthony told me at first it was supposed to be like 12 issues, but then they announced that like issue number 6 or whatever was the last issue.
The
So,
Neil before Zod.
yeah. And so that's another example where they just that's like half the story. It's gone now. So I feel like there's a lot of that happening in the comic books. And I read that, the conclusion to the X-Men stuff recently with the Krakoan era and the House of X. And I mean, the conclusion was okay. And I feel like that era kind of dragged on a lot longer than even Jonathan Hickman wanted it to. So it was kind of glad to see it done. But at the same way, it was also kind of like, that's it. That's all. So yeah, there seems to be a lot of that happening in the industry. And I guess it's just, and I feel like especially Marvel and DC, they haven't quite figured out how to change with all these changes that have happened, and with the comic industry and with digital and all that, especially now that Comixology has been, destroyed by Amazon. So now we have the Marvel Unlimited app, which is decent, but still has some problems with it. There's the DC app, which I can't even use because they won't open it outside of like 5 countries. So
I don't understand that. Like, I just like, why are you restricting your content, especially in an age where a lot of people will go through sinister means to get it because they don't care once you make it unavailable to them.
Well, I mean, and so much stuff from DC, it's so weird because, back when I was in high school, DC was always really good at the trade games. They'd always had like trade paperbacks coming out after the comics storylines are finished. And then Marvel, they had like nothing. And then in the early 2000s, that changed. And then Marvel started putting out trades of everything. And now Marvel is so much better at the trade game than DC. I mean, Marvel's got all these epic collections, all these different, versions of these different trades and stuff that you can get. Trades are coming out very quickly. They're often on sale on Amazon. And then DC, it takes like maybe 6 months for the trade to come out. And then when it does, it'll take like another 6 months before they even think about discounting it. And then there's stuff from like, like the early 2000s Superman stuff, which is unavailable. They start these trade lines and then they just kind of end them after book 1 or 2. I'm still waiting for Judd Winnick's Outsiders book 2, which doesn't seem like it's ever going to be published.
Part of our where we're reading right now is in the podcast is we're exploring the New 52 Superman and action titles, and we're reading them by trade, because one of the things we talked about was how the New 52 was constructed a lot around trades, because this seemed like everything was written with a 6-issue arc for the trades. And that's a big part of our conversation piece, because a lot of people wait for the trades. I got caught up on a lot of comics at that time because I got the trades from the library, and I think trades are very important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I think it's wild, and that I don't envy you to going through the New 52s with the Superman trades because it's not like the Batman series where the trades are all nice and neat and all easily numbered. The Superman ones are kind of a mess. There's like, okay, here's this one, here's like the first two, and then the other ones, and they're not numbered at all. So you just have to like read the descriptions, kind of piece together which one goes where.
It's
So I thought
weird
I had,
because
yeah, I thought I had the whole set of them, and then I found out I'm missing like 3 books.
they have the first half of the New 52, and then they had this like soft reboot in the middle that they refer to as the DCU, which is YOU. And that's like when Superman wore the t-shirt again, he got depowered, and all the other characters went through a slight change, and they like rechanged the numbering and stuff. And we are also seeing like how with the Superman titles, they had so many crossovers with the other Superman books that you can't read them straight because after like the first 2, you start to get lost because there's chapters and pieces missing because you have to go read Action or Superboy or Supergirl or Superman and Wonder Woman to understand what's going on. So it's interesting little experiment we're doing.
Yeah, I had to deal with that with the I think it was the Dark Multiverse or the Dark Crisis, one of those where they were interlocking series, right? So it's like this issue starts here and then it continues in this issue here, but they didn't print them as a complete volume. They printed them as separate volumes. So you start reading that and then you're like, wait, what are they talking about here? And then you have to go flip back and forth between the 2 trades, as opposed to just doing like, here's, the crossover volume 1, here's the crossover volume 2, everything in chronological order. So I don't know who is in charge of DC's reprint game, but it's got to be somebody's incompetent cousin, because there's no excuse for what they've been doing there. But anyway, today we are going to be talking about, well, we're continuing a nice little tradition among Superman podcasters where we have Superman podcasters on and they choose a movie that seems completely different from anything related to the character of Superman. We've had this joke with Anthony a few times because every time he comes, like 2 or 3 times he came on, we were talking about Punisher movies. And now you're coming on to talk about The Crow Salvation. So we're going to get into that, but we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come back and we will jump into the movie. Since you're listening to this show, I already know you love watching superhero movies and TV shows, and you just might enjoy superhero comics. But how about superhero novels? I'm giving away 2 free superhero novels and 1 free superhero short story. Visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP to get access to Vanguard, Heroes Forged, the first novel in my own Avengers and X-Men inspired superhero novel series, and Ronin Born, my cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic Japan. I'm also throwing in Fire and Lightning, a free prequel story to my new Power Rangers inspired superhero series, Omega Knights. So visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP. Those are just the letters SCP to get started, or click on the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show. And we're back. And as I mentioned right before the break, today we are talking about The Crow Salvation. This was the 3rd film in the series, which started obviously with the well-regarded Brandon Lee film, which also we talked about way back in the early episodes. And we also talked about City of Angels, which started the tradition that this movie continues of having a different actor as the Crow, as the main character, since, Brandon Lee originally signed on to do sequels at the time. I'm not quite sure how that would have worked out because, he was supposed to die in the original screenplay at the end of the movie. So I'm not sure if they were just going to have him like, a reincarnated, different characters, but Brandon Lee would be playing them all, or what they were going to do with that. But whatever the case, just like the comics too, each story focuses on a different character being resurrected from the dead. And this was also the first one that did not get a theatrical release. It was like this one and the sequel, the 4th and final one in this series, Wicked Prayer. This was released direct to video. So Tyler, what is your history with The Crow? Were you a fan of him before this series, and kind of what's your history with this movie?
Yeah, so I I chose this one because I'm looking at what you had available to talk to. And I want to talk about this because, of course, now we're in the era of the new film. I refuse to call it a remake because it's not. And I won't go down that hole on the right now. But um, the Crow film, what's funny is the first movie came out in '94, and I remember being at the movie theater seeing, if I remember correctly, it was Maverick, starring Mel Gibson, directed by Richard Donner, and there was a big poster for the Crow in the theater, and just being like intrigued by that poster. And it wouldn't be till I think about 99, 2000 until I actually got to watch the movie. I was a teenager then, and I got and that was right around the time this one came out. And I think it was seeing this one come out at the video store that kind of sparked my, oh yeah, I always wanted to go back and watch. And I watched, the first ones, then City of Angels, then Salvation. And somebody at school, I remember, had the soundtrack to Salvation and was like listening to it in their portable CD player. Portable CD player, kids, were these things we carried around with us that had played a CD, which is like a disc, physical disc of music. And then then I went and read the book. And the book was something I got when I was, like I said, I was about 15. And then I think the book and I have an interesting here because I read about every 5 years. And I feel like revisiting, I always get more out of it as I get older and just understand it more. And I just remember, I won't even talk about Wicked Prayer because I was excited when that movie, I heard that was coming out, just because I had really got into this series. Wicked Prayer is pure garbage. Maybe I would watch the Crow television series, all of it, before I would watch Wicked Prayer. I went and saw the 30th anniversary of the first Crow movie a month or two ago when it was re-released in theaters. And beforehand, me and my friend were playing in the theater everything we would watch before ever watching Wicked Prayer. And then other people in the theater started joining us. I would watch Halle Berry's Catwoman over Wicked Prayer, which is a better Crow movie than Wicked Prayer. But this one, what's interesting about this film is it's in some ways it's lower budget than City of Angels. But I think if it had more money and stuff invested into it, it could have been a better movie. City of Angels, you've talked about it, I know, is so weird because it was shot one way, then edited to try to be more like the first movie. It ended up kind of losing some of its identity. It's a weird mess of a movie. But I feel like this one's a little bit more straightforward. Like there's not the production problems as far as re-editing it to try to make it something else. And I feel like there was a chance with this one to do better, but I think this one's better than City of Angels. And I've just always been fascinated with the concept of the Crow. Like on my Requel podcast I talked about, I have my pitch. I pitched for a Crow movie that I ask everyone to go check out and listen to. I apologize for the audio. It's not the best because I was recording it when I was driving, but I didn't realize that it switched my phone from my phone microphone to the car because I was driving a work car. So it was recording me through the car instead of through my phone. So it's a little bit airy. But I like the idea of the story, the person who's murdered, wrong, revenge, coming back from the dead and living with that pain and then kind of going through this cycle to find redemption for them and their loved one. And I like the idea that every movie is its own story. I don't think that you need to carry the character of the Crow through different films. Each story should be a one and done kind of thing. It gives you a different play, sandbox. City of Angels introduced father son, and then this one was returned to two lovers. So it's not without its faults and its flaws, but I do think it's a better sequel than City of Angels was.
See, I just like you, I had seen like the posters and like the TV commercials for the original Crow back when it came out in '94. But I didn't watch it at that time, and it wasn't until maybe a few years later, probably, I think I was in junior high at the time, so this probably would have been like 97-ish or something, is when I finally watched it for the first time. And I fell in love with the movie from the first time I watched it. And then I went and I watched City of Angels, and I hated it the first time I watched it. Um, and then when this came out, I was in high school, and I found it really interesting because this came out at like this weird time where there was kind of like this Crow resurgence. Like you mentioned, there was the TV show, which I gotta admit, it's a guilty pleasure of mine. I dig the TV show, especially the latter half of that season. The latter half was really solid.
When it took it on its own identity, like I just rewatched a bunch of them. It's on YouTube, and the first part's weird because it's trying to basically do the TV version of the movie, and then it starts to take on its own identity, and it's enjoyable. Like you said, it's a guilty pleasure. I mean, it's syndicated '90s TV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, especially Mark Dacascos and Mark Gnomes. I thought they both did a really good job, especially when their relationship they really started to get a feel for each other as performers, and they really started to get a feel for their characters. I thought it really got really interesting, probably in that second half, and that was when they started having a little bit more, longer form storytelling instead of just kind of like this random merit badge of the week, which is, I think he even refers it to at that at one point. and yeah, definitely has problems. It's the syndication budget obviously shows, and also the fact that it's almost always filmed during the day, which definitely takes something away from it. But also too, I don't know if you ever read this, but there was also an Image comic published at the same time by John J. Muth, and it was a bunch of different artists at first, but eventually I think it was I'm blanking on the guy, but he also did Alias with Bendis and also Bendis's Daredevil run. But he ended up becoming like the regular artist and like towards the end of it. But it was only 10 issues, but it also had this idea of like the TV show where it was going to continue Eric Draven's story. And it's since been, IDW now has the rights to the Crow comic, so they've since republished it as one of their, I think it was like Nightmares or Waking Nightmares or something like that trade series. So I reread that too recently. And that was interesting because that was that was much darker than the TV show, and it had like this much more like almost like philosophical tone to it. So it was and it had maybe a bit more like, almost like Lynchian quality to some of the stories and threats he was going up against. So I thought it was really underrated and very interesting.
It blows my mind that the Crow in many ways is a very simple property, and yet no one's figured out how to really the comics, yes, and it's like, but as far as adapting to film, they haven't figured out how to do it without trying to do what's already been done, or just it's not that difficult of a means to accomplish. The Salvation I liked, had an interesting premise with the main protagonist, Alex Corvus, because everyone's name has to be somehow related to a bird. And then we had Kirsten Dunst, and this is right before her resurgence with Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
And she's in it. So Corvus, is for murder for his girlfriend, and he is executed. And it's the first time we do something a little bit different where the Crow face isn't like makeup, it's like torn flesh from his face melting and the mask coming off where he was executed. So I thought that was kind of different, so that you're finding a way to do the look without just kind of copying what had been done before. He's trying to find out why he was framed for his girlfriend's murder. So it's a little bit more of a murder mystery compared to the other films where we know who the killers are and they're just hunting them down. So there's a little bit more of this detective story of him trying to figure things out. you have a neat story of like sisterly love between his girlfriend, whose name was Lauren, and her sister was Erin, who was Kirsten Dunst. And I just found it more interesting. I think that all the Crow movies have an issue with their villains, with sometimes being over the top or being connected to the supernatural. This was the most grounded villain at the time. It still is the most grounded villain, even though the villain is into some weird stuff. Like, no Crow villain's just a normal bad guy. They're all like have some sort of weird fetish or something. But this one's
Which
the
is
most.
which is a weird thing when you think about it, because even in the original comic, none of them had any sort of supernatural connection. And in fact, most of the comics, there's not often a supernatural connection between the villain, but they feel like they have to have that for, I don't know, I guess like symmetry, storytelling symmetry, or
right,
something like that.
and I don't like that.
No, I
I
don't either.
think I like the idea that the Crow is backed by these supernatural forces that outweighs the bad, and not only is the Crow able to, stop the evil, but he's also battling himself too. Like, City of Angels has the worst villain. It is the most out there, what the heck is this person villain with Judah. Like, it's just what? Like, I was trying to describe it to my wife when we were talking about the movies, and I was just like, I was like, I don't even know. I don't even know how to do it. Like, it's just, he is so far just bizarre gone that I don't even know how to describe that villain.
And one of the
But
weird things that I get your point. I mean, I kind of have a soft spot for Judah Earl and for City of Angels after I learned about the production of it, and then I ended up finding the City of Angels comic book that David Goyer had
ooh,
written, and that was his original story basically, and I'm like,
I gotta find
oh,
it.
it's, you may have to go through some of those nefarious means we were talking about earlier,
Okay.
but because that's what I had to do, but because it's completely out of print, and nobody's interested in reprinting the adaptation of a movie that has been like universally reviled. But
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting as a comic book, and it was they did, and you could see what Goyer was trying to do and what Tim Pope was trying to do as well, and just like how much the studio just butchered that film. So when I watch City of Angels, I kind of pretend that I kind of fill in the holes in my mind as I'm watching it, and I enjoy it a lot more. However, at the time I saw this, I did like this more at the time, and I thought, okay, this is really good, this is really solid. And then on repeat viewings, the holes in it started coming through a little bit. And I think the villain's a good place to start, because I think that's you have Fred Ward playing this corrupt police captain. Great casting choice. I think Fred Ward's like the perfect actor for this. But him being tied to the supernatural, like I can see, you know, Michael Wincott's Top Dollar being tied to the
Yeah.
supernatural because he's a weird looking guy. I can't remember who played Judah Earl, but same thing. Like, he's such a weird guy
Yes.
that it doesn't surprise me. This guy just seems like, okay, full on corrupt cop.
Yep.
Totally get that, but he just does not fit the model at all of being like someone who's all into the supernatural, and
Yeah.
it throws me for a loop every time he starts talking about crows and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. The other problem with the villains is it's always like every main villain also has a like female counterpart sidekick, and like it's usually like some sort of psychic or like a witch or something. And in this, she's not really like that, but there is a woman who still plays that role. And like I said, it's the better version, but it's just like they always figure out like, oh, if we take out the Crow, we take his power. I'm like, really? Like, always like, oh, the bird gets shot. Or in this one particularly made me mad though, when they do the whole thing, we'll trick him to believe that he's got the man with the scar on his arm, and then that'll cause him to give up and die. And I'm just like watching, like, no, that's not how it works. Because even if you tricked Eric, or not Eric, maybe it's just the actor, sorry, in this, Alex is the character. the crow, the bird, the spirit, whatever, would still know you're not done. So like that was just one of those plots in this. I'm like, okay, that's too much. But this, the story of a father who has a business that gets involved with dirty cops. His daughter finds out the cops murder his daughter is a stronger story because he's trying to protect his other daughter and live with the guilt that he goes through. And they find the scapegoat with Alex. I think it's a stronger story that I like the mystery aspect, of this one compared to where we as the audience are kind of going with Alex, like, okay, who did kill her? Who were the actual killers? From the beginning, he's saying, I'm innocent. I'm innocent. And the only person that believes him is his attorney. And we're going to go on this kind of journey with him to discover who really did this deed. This is an early film by the great Walton Goggins. I love Walton Goggins. I mean, the dude is an amazing actor. And I feel bad that he's even in this movie because out of everyone in this movie, I'm looking at, like, he probably is the best actor in this film, even though his character is not the best, just him.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm always surprised when I saw his name pop up. I'm like, oh yeah. And I was reading the trivia and, don't feel too sorry for him being in this movie because apparently this is what ended up landing him on The Shield, which then ended up, propelling his career forward to stuff like Justified and Sons of Anarchy and so on and so forth. So yeah, this worked out well for him. Whereas, Eric Mabius has just done like a bunch of like
Hallmark stuff,
some sort of Hallmark stuff set in a post office or something like that. And Kirsten Dunst, obviously, right? Oh yeah, that's right. He was in one of the Resident Evil movies too.
That's the only two places I know him was Resident Evil and then this. So I think I saw Resident Evil maybe before this.
Oh really? Okay, yeah, I saw this before, and then I watched Resident Evil just recently, like a few years ago, and then I'm like, this guy looks familiar, and I looked him up, and saw it was Eric Mabius. And I get what you're saying, and I agree with you for the most part. I think that the spine of the story is good. It's this, this idea of like these corrupt cops and everything, and they're involved in this business deal with her father, and they. And he's trying to protect he's trying to protect the other daughter, and then they pick Alex to be the patsy, and then the idea of him having to figure out the mystery. I think all of that is a really good idea, but I feel like some of the execution and this is kind of where I wonder how much studio interference was there with like, hey, we got to make it like the original. We got to have it fit the same beats of the original. So he goes to the witnesses and it's just like the same thing, right? It's just like, okay, let's kill each one of them and then just move on to the next guy, And then the whole idea, like the biggest mystery is the idea of the man with the scar. And I'm just like, you're just ripping off The Fugitive now. This is all you're doing here. So like all of that stuff, I felt like, and I'm totally with you on the idiocy of let's trick him into believing that he's killed the guy and then his powers will magically go away. That was the dumbest thing I remember thinking when I rewatched this movie for this show. And I feel like if you do, honestly, I think, Edward R. Pressman and Jeff Most have to let go of this franchise because I think they're the ones who keep dragging it back to making it stuff like the original. I haven't seen the new one yet, but I have heard it. I was going into it with an open mind, but I've heard it's really bad. So it doesn't look like any lessons were really learned yet.
There are, once again, the new one, much like this movie, the seeds are there, the ideas are there, but it's the execution that is off. And it's like, it shouldn't be this difficult to do. I have to just say the new movie, I give it props for not trying to harken back to the original. And the new film would have done much better had it got a subtitle and not, just The Crow, if it had been like The Crow Requiem or The Crow something, and they hadn't used the names Eric and Shelley because honestly, there's no reason for them to use those names. And this is, like I said, the idea, the story was there, but the execution is off. One thing I don't like in this film is I like the idea that Crow brings you back like a year later or something. I like the idea of the time elapse because then I don't feel like the death works as well because you could just be like, oh, did we just kill this guy? Maybe we really didn't kill him. But having, Alex dead and then a year later, all of a sudden he shows back up. There's a hauntingness to it because aren't you dead? Didn't we kill you? But he like dies and then he's like back, like just a beat later. So that was something in this one. I was very much like, okay.
You're right. I completely missed that aspect of it. But yeah, and the other two ones, it was like a year later, and in some of the comics and the books and stuff like that, it can be even longer. Like I remember the second one when Obar wrote the I can't remember what the title was, but it was actually a Native American character who came back in the modern day, and like he had been killed by Confederate soldiers, and the Confederate soldiers were resurrected as reincarnated as like a biker gang. So it was like 100 years in that case.
See, that was really good book. That would make an interesting. I think honestly, just to throw my pitch out there, other than my movie pitch I made, I think The Crow would work as an anthology series of like 3 to 6, like 30 to 40 minute episodes, depending on, and just like on a streamer. You know what I'm saying? Like you could do some of these, like the one you just described as like a second season, to where the thing that's going on is this idea of coming back, and each season's a new story, a new Crow, and you go through it differently. The means, instead of trying to do movies, I think an anthology series and using these comics, and if you do a 39-40 minute episode, you do like 3 or 6 of those depending on how you structure, I think would be the sweet spot of bringing this property back.
Oh, that'd be a great idea. I think you're absolutely right. And in now, anthology type shows have gotten more popular on streamers like Black Mirror, which everything is a different episode. But you also have stuff like, American Horror Story, where each season has its own arc. Exactly. And I think that would be really interesting. And you could too do like American Horror Story does, where they had like, they have the same actors, but they're playing different parts in each season. So I think that would be a really cool aspect of it. And there's some changes that they make here that I do think were good. And like the whole idea of, like you mentioned, the scars coming from the electrocution mask, I thought was a really nice way of changing things up a little bit. The fact that we're getting away from the fact that, the guy who dies always has to have long hair. So I thought that was also a nice little if we had here. He's not wearing, the kind of like, gothic black leather. Instead, he's wearing his prison jumpsuit instead, and he does eventually steal one of the coats, because the Crow's always got to have a coat, I guess. But all that was really I thought those were like nice little touches they did to try and differentiate themselves a little bit. Now maybe it's his performance as Alex. I feel like and again, I'm not sure how much of this is studio interference, but there are some times when I feel like he's doing a really good job, and like, because you had Brandon Lee in the first one, who had this kind of like, he made these little quips here and there, but mostly he was he's pretty serious throughout the most of it. And you had Vincent Perez, who was, and it's kind of an interesting performance, but I feel like maybe it didn't really quite know what he wanted to do. Like some of the stuff works, like when the cop pulls over those two women and he's talking about, reporting an officer down and all that. I thought that was a lot of fun, but other times I just feel like he's not quite, and I don't feel like I'm getting a really good sense of who his character is.
I agree. I think there's a struggle in one breath to identify who Alex is and then Alex as the Crow, because I think some of the quieter moments that we're supposed to get to know Alex don't always really work, like when he's with his attorney, when he's with Aaron. I think another problem is, I mean, Moebius is what, in his mid-20s in this? Mid to late 20s, and he's supposed to be like 18. You know, why? Why not just let him play to the age that he's supposed to be? Or cast somebody who's younger, you know, because they're trying to make this like are they trying to tap into this the idea of young love, eternal love, you know, this 18-year-old. So he had to have met Lauren when he's 17. It doesn't work. Okay. You know, like, because it was his 18th, right? Not his 21st. It was like his 18th. He was being.
It was, yeah. I think so. I believe it was his 18th birthday or so. Might have been his. I can't remember exactly, but
I'm pretty sure it was It was like that, and I was just like,
yeah. And they keep calling him like a kid and everything like that. And I'm just like,
then get someone that's a kid, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I just let him be the age he's supposed to, and I think, you know, this is an issue with all the Crow films, is like trying to see the character before the death and trying to find a way to tap into the character before their death and after. And you know, it's subtle how they do it in the original film with like some of the flashbacks, and I think the interaction, you know, in this film you definitely have Kirsten Dunst kind of in that role of like what Sarah was in the original, compared, so that you have this younger female counterpart that he's related to. And in some ways, this movie, as much as it's different, tries to hit those same kind of beats and archetypes as the first movie. And, you know, the first movie is really good. But even then, that movie is a departure from the graphic novel in itself. But yet, every Crow sequel tries, instead of going back to the source material, just tries to harken back to the first film. So it really puts itself in a box. I do appreciate with this one, they got away from like the extreme, bizarre, almost unrealistic world of like some gothic underground, almost post-apocalyptic. Because like City of Angels, let's just face it, that LA was something.
It's a weird version of LA. I definitely grant you that. It does. And yeah, the Crow feels like the least bizarre thing in that world.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the original is supposed to be Detroit, and even though it doesn't really feel like the most empty city in the world, there's at least some sort of feeling towards it. And this one, I guess, is the closest to feeling more realistic, even though it does still have some of that energy. I mean, this came out in 2000s, but like early, wasn't it 2000? It's still a
2000 exactly, yeah.
It's still a 90s film. Let's just be honest. Okay.
It is.
So it still has all that 90s aesthetics to it, with coloring, saturation, music, tonality. It came out June 28th in Belgium. So when did it come out in the States?
I believe it was like that, or like that fall, because I think I was already in school when it came out, and I wanted to go. There was like one theater near me that had a screening, and I wasn't able to get to it.
September 15th, 2000.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, it's still like, it's like one of those movies that I bet they wanted to release sooner. You know, it came out, it's still like a 90s movie, even though it's technically not. So yeah.
And also well, it's funny enough, you talk about the age too, is that Moebius had auditioned for the original movie too. So he's
yeah, he's not a spring chicken. Just let him be. Let him be okay. Just to pull this up, let's see. Where I'm always used to looking at IMDb on my phone and not the computer.
While you're doing that too, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the production here, because before this movie, ended up being put into production, they actually asked Rob Zombie to do it, and he was going to come out with The Crow 2037, and he had a really interesting version of it, which, you know, it was going to be a lot more horror based, and it was going to be a much more like it was going to be kind of like a post-apocalyptic type thing, because it would have begun in 2010 when a young boy and his mother murdered on Halloween night by a satanic priest. A year later, the boy is resurrected as the Crow. 27 years later, unaware of his past, he's become a bounty hunter on a collision course with his now all-powerful killer. And he had worked on this for like 18 months, and eventually they decided, no, we're not going to go with this take. We're going to do something. We're going to do The Crow's Salvation instead, make it, and originally Zombie's approach was going to get its own thing called like Black Rider X, but then I'd never heard anything else about it after that. So, I mean, I'm really curious what they would have done, what Rob Zombie would have. I'm not, you know, based on some of his horror movies, I'm not so sure if the direction would have been all that great, because I'm not a big fan of those movies, but at least it would have been something a lot more interesting to watch, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this one, like I said, in a lot of ways, Salvation is more harkened story-wise to the first Crow, maybe not visually. I think there's some interesting bones in the Rob Zombie story for the Crow, but I think that also proves how the concept can be more than what these films have made it out to be. You know, I think about what time frame that was. That was before House of a Thousand Corpses, right?
Yeah.
So you know, Rob, he hadn't even done his first film yet. So it could have been a really disastrous. I think he got better as a filmmaker. That's a whole nother podcast. There's interesting things he's done where I feel like, oh, he's actually doing well. Then he'll completely do something like, nope, and we're back to being bad. But I like I said, I like this concept. I think it's so simple. I think there's still a really great Crow movie out there that you can do without. I don't think you ever need to remake the first one. Like you don't, because the first one's departed enough from the book that you can still do elements from the book and make it into its own story. And The Crow is such a simple concept that can be rebooted and continued without ever having to cross paths with what's been done before. They just haven't been able to figure out how to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think they're just too tied to that first movie and how it did but that first movie, it was like lightning in a bottle, really. You had like this perfect storm of elements that came together at just the right time and place. And this one just doesn't really, you know, bring anything new to the table. It seems to on its surface, but when you kind of scratch beneath that surface, you see it's just kind of like it's just window dressing for the same old story. And you're right, it is such a simple concept, and I agree, you don't really have to do the original one over again. Or I would say, if you do want to do another adaptation of the original, then go back to the original graphic novel, because, you know, as much as I love that original movie, it was a pretty big departure in a lot of ways from the graphic novel. It got the spirit of it right, but you know, the actual beats of the story and all that are very different, especially when you get in the whole theory where he's just hallucinating this whole thing as he lies dying in a coma. I think they're really, yeah. It's one of those things, those interpretations of it that I love. And if you could play with that aspect of it, I think that would make it for a really unique adaptation. Or if you wanted to do it, you know, like we were saying, as a TV show or something, and adapt the John J. Muth approach, I thought that'd be really interesting to watch too. But if you're just going to keep doing these movies, then find some different ways to do it. I mean, I do give credit to City of Angels for making it a father and son thing instead, but it's still just, you know, it's still just the same idea. It's like this gang of guys they come across. Like one of the Crow comics, and I haven't read this one. It's set in a concentration camp, in Nazi concentration camp. Like that's a brilliant idea for a Crow movie. Or, you know, going with the whole corrupt police angle, and with all this stuff about racial justice protests and police brutality, that story right there writes itself. And you could also have like different types of characters coming in, not always, some pale, pasty-faced white guy with black hair.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we've pitched quite a few really good, solid ideas.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty good note to end on too, because I don't think we have a whole lot more to say, unless there's anything else that we haven't touched on you wanted to mention.
No, that's I'm good.
Okay. So yeah, that wraps it up on The Crow's salvation. So Tyler, thanks so much for coming on, and why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Just find me, look for Krypton Report wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube, or JTY Patrick on X, Twitter, and you'll find me there. And then Jonathan Tyler Patrick for my Requel podcast.
Okay, great. We'll have links to that in the show notes, so please make sure to check that out. And as for us, superherocinemaphiles.com is the website, and we are Super Cinema Pod on the socials, which is Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads these days. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Hey guys, Perry here. Just a quick note that we'll be taking a brief hiatus for the holidays. I'll be putting up some holiday-themed SCP Classic episodes for you to listen to, and then we will be back after the new year. It's been a rough year. Hope there's more good than bad for you, and hopefully next year will be better. Stay safe, happy holidays, and enjoy the time off however you may spend it. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late, great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.